Shirley, do you want to go ahead and get started? You're muted.
I'm going to say welcome to everyone and ask Jane Armstrong to open our program tonight.
Jane, are you muted?
I just asked her to unmute, so we'll see.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome to everybody tonight. We are having a wonderful presentation from an organization that got started about a year and a half ago called Sarasota Strong. And that's when I first met Andrea Blanch, who's one of our two speakers tonight. Sarasota Strong got started around the whole notion of what a trauma-informed community is. And it's a grassroots organization that Andy has been instrumental in pulling together across both North and South County. She comes to us with a long history of having done this sort of work before coming to Sarasota. So I'm really delighted to be able to have her speak for VICA and do this presentation. She's a PhD and a former state mental health commissioner on top of what she's doing right now. So Andy, take it away.
Okay, are you going to do a quick intro of Helen, or would you like me to do that?
I was going to let you do that.
Oh, okay. So, first off, let me say a quick thanks to VICA for focusing on this issue for the last few years. You have been such an example to the whole community of how this is not an issue you learn about and then you're done with it. And your persistence is really admirable. And you've done an extraordinary job at unpacking some of the structural aspects of racism. So when Shirley came to me and conveyed that she was interested in taking a more of a psychological look to look at how racism impacts people as individuals, I was just thrilled. So I'm really happy to be here. Our plan for tonight is I'm going to provide some really basic information about trauma and how it affects people, how it affects the brain. And then my esteemed colleague and very dear friend, Helen Neal-Ali, is going to speak to the personal experience of being an African-American growing up in a racist society and how she healed herself and is now in the process of healing others from the impact of trauma and racism. Helen has been one of the founding members and one of the most important leaders in Sarasota Strong, really bringing her own experience and her great wisdom about trauma healing to the community. We couldn't be doing what we're doing without Helen, so I'm just thrilled that she was willing to join us tonight. So let's get started. Next slide. So what is trauma and how does it affect us? That's where we're going to start. Next slide. Basically, trauma results from any experience or any set of circumstances that overwhelms your ability to cope. It's that simple. And there are a lot of different types of trauma that I want to just run through, because usually we think of one or two kinds of trauma and we don't realize all the different ways that we can be traumatized in the course of our lives. So acute trauma is what we usually think of. That's an experience that's singular, very intense, very negative. Think of being raped or a soldier coming back from a war zone. It's the type of trauma that we usually associate with PTSD. But the truth of the matter is, the brain actually reacts in an identical manner to circumstances that grind you down over time. So things like poverty and racism, or just constantly being humiliated or belittled, we call those things toxic stress. And we didn't know this 20 years ago, but we've learned that toxic stress affects the brain and the body just as seriously as more acute and intense forms of trauma. Complex developmental trauma refers to multiple sources of trauma that occur over an extended period of time, particularly starting in childhood. This is really important because the earlier that trauma occurs, the more serious the consequences are likely to be. So a child who experiences trauma in utero or as an infant is likely to have complex developmental trauma because that's when the brain is developing, and the trauma affects the development of the brain. This is also pretty new information. It wasn't very long ago, really no more than 15 or 20 years ago, when you would hear people saying, if something awful would happen to a baby, and you'd hear people saying, oh, it's okay, she won't even remember what happened when she grows up. As if it wouldn't be traumatic because she wouldn't remember it. Well, in fact, she won't remember it, but that doesn't mean it isn't affecting the brain, it isn't affecting the body. And unpacking that kind of developmental trauma is one of our major challenges right now. Betrayal trauma is the kind of trauma that happens when trauma occurs at the hands of somebody you have every reason to believe ought to be taking care of you. So trauma at the hands of a family member or a teacher or a sports coach, somebody that you trust with your very essence. That involves not only the impact of trauma, but the breaking of the trust, the betrayal, and that can be very difficult to heal from. And that brings us to moral injury. Again, something we're just now learning about. Moral injury was first studied in the military, and it occurs when somebody is brought by whatever circumstances to doing something that is contrary to their own morality, their own moral upbringing, their own conscience. So soldiers who were brought up to believe killing is a sin, when they're put in a situation of killing as a soldier, it can create huge internal conflict, even if they're justified in doing it. So the more we learn about this, like betrayal trauma, because it affects your very identity and sort of your belief in God and yourself, can be very, very difficult to heal from. I think this is particularly interesting in this context because think of people who are brought up as good Christians, but who simultaneously are brought up to hate and to be racist. I believe, and you know, this is an empirical question, but my own feeling is a lot of the vitriol and the anger and the rage we see in parts of society that are very racist is due to moral injury, that the racists themselves are suffering consciously or unconsciously from the conflict that their own behavior is causing them internally. Vicarious trauma, also it's really important to recognize that witnessing trauma or hearing about trauma can have exactly the same impact on your brain and on your body and on your life as experiencing it yourself. So a child who witnesses domestic violence in the home is being as seriously traumatized as the person who is personally experiencing the domestic violence. This happens because of cells in the brain that are called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons actually mirror in the brain what's happening to you, what's happening to somebody else. So they're really important because they're the basis of empathy. That's mirror neurons are why we can empathize with another human being. But they also trick the brain into thinking that what's happening to that other person is happening to us. So this is a huge issue for first responders, for anybody who is constantly interacting with people who have trauma histories, because they're going to be experiencing it as well. So we really have to pay attention to this. Intergenerational trauma, we know that patterns of trauma are passed down from generation to generation. The children of a domestic violence situation are more likely to end up in domestic violence situations when they grow up. We've known this for years. Lots of reasons why this happens. And historical trauma is intergenerational trauma taken to the next level, so that we can actually experience trauma that happened not to us and not to our relatives, but to our people. So this was first studied in Native Americans. And part of the reason that Native Americans show so much impact of trauma on their own lives is because it wasn't very long ago, 100 years ago, that their people, there was a genocide against their people, and they were being sent off as a people to camps where they couldn't speak their language. We actually now know the biological mechanism for historical trauma, and that's epigenetics. And I will say just a quick something about epigenetics because I have enough time. It's fascinating. And if you want to learn more, there's a Nova video called The Ghost in the Genes. It's really worth watching. Real quickly, we know that our genetic makeup is permanent, right? We can't change it. It isn't affected by anything that happens to us. We get it from our parents. But there's a thing called the epigenome that we're learning about now, which is essentially the program, like a computer program, that controls the hardware of your genetic makeup. So the epigenome basically can turn genes on and off. And unlike the genes, the epigenome is very sensitive to things that happen to you during your lifetime. So if you experience trauma, it could cause your epigenome to turn a gene on or off. Then that gene will be passed to your children in that stage of either on or off, depending on what happened to you, and it will continue to be passed down from generation to generation until something happens like healing that turns it back in the other direction. So the bottom line here is that you can actually be experiencing the consequences of trauma that happened to your grandparents. Okay? Let that sink in. We first learned about this studying the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, but it's since the science is growing by leaps and bounds. It's pretty well established at this point. And it's very hopeful because the epigenome is so sensitive to what happens to you. So if you're experiencing historical trauma that's epigenetically related, if you do some trauma healing, you can switch that gene back on and interrupt the cycle of passing it on to your children. So it's really incredibly hopeful period of time that we're in. Next slide. So in order to understand the impact of trauma, you have to understand a little bit about the brain. And we all have heard of the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? This is the fundamental thing to understand about the brain and trauma. So you're driving down the road and somebody pulls in front of you and you have to swerve to not hit him. You almost get in a car accident. And what happens, right? Your heart starts beating, you're sweating, adrenaline is pumping through your system. That's your body's response to danger. And it's very adaptive because it helps you either, fight the danger, freeze like a bunny so that the predator doesn't see you, or get the H out of there. That's a response that's hardwired to keep us safe. It's a good thing, right? But now imagine if the fear situation, if the danger never went away. Okay, so you're a child and you never know if your daddy's going to come home drunk and beat you. Or you're a child and you don't ever know when your older Black brother is going to be killed for driving while Black. Living in conditions of constant stress and fear is basically the biological mechanism through which trauma affects our brains and our bodies. There are two parts of the brain. The wizard brain, we simplify this so that it's easy to remember. The lizard brain is the back part of your brain that controls the autonomic nervous system and the fight, flight, fear response. The front part of your brain, the frontal cortex, is the wizard brain. That's where all the smart stuff happens, like thinking and making decisions and planning. The thing to know about that is if you're in your lizard brain, if you're back there, if you're in a fight, flight, freeze, or a trauma response, you literally can't think, okay? You can't because you're in the wrong part of the brain. And knowing that is really important because you can't reason with somebody who's in the middle of a trauma response. Somebody who's emotionally escalated, you have to regulate the brain, the nervous system, before you can have a rational conversation. So trauma also affects health as well as mental health. The ACE study, which I won't go into, has found extraordinarily high correlations between trauma experienced in childhood and a whole host of health conditions like heart disease and lung disease and cancer and autoimmune diseases. Virtually every chronic health problem is very closely associated with trauma in childhood. The other thing to know about the impact of trauma is that it's not just PTSD. It actually affects every aspect of our lives. It affects kids' ability to attend in school and to learn. It affects your ability to form lasting relationships. For adults, it can affect their ability to get and keep a job. So the impact of trauma is so broad that, that it really behooves us to be compassionate to everybody, because no matter what a person is doing that's making you crazy or frustrated or whatever, that person has a story you know nothing about. And it's very possible that whatever that person is doing is linked to a trauma history. So, next slide. Are we ready to move on? Yeah. So I already talked about the fact that you can't reason with somebody who's in a trauma response. So regulate, then relate, and then reason. Regulation is not that hard. Rhythmic, repetitive behavior can help you regulate. There are lots of ways to help people regulate their emotional responses. But if there's one thing that you remember about the impact of trauma on the brain, especially early in life, is that it affects people's ability to regulate their own emotions. So when you see people who are caught by a very intense emotion and they're having difficulty controlling it, it very well may be trauma related. Okay, let's go to the next one. And real quick, I'm not going to go through this slide. This just shows some of the very many ways in which racism can affect people. It's not just overt racial behaviors, it's the microaggressions, remember that toxic stress stuff, the hypervigilance that people experience because of PTSD wears you out. There's so many different ways in which racism can affect people psychologically. And that's what Helen is going to talk about. So I'm going to turn it over to her at this point.
All right.
Next slide.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about trauma as being an African American woman. And I'm going to talk about how trauma, racism and trauma affects a person of color. Number one, I can say that I am 63 years old and I have experienced trauma from a child. Even as an individual, I've had, grew up in a neighborhood which was predominantly mixed. It was a mixed neighborhood. I didn't grow up in a predominantly all Caucasian neighborhood like a lot of people did. I grew up in a mixed neighborhood. But there was still racism in that neighborhood, like even going to school. I'll get to that in organizations. But when I was a little girl and I ended up going to a predominantly all-white school because of the neighborhood that my parents moved into, and they would only put one African American in the classroom. So at an early age, I was wondering, why can't we be together? We were separated. It was like maybe one in each class as I was growing up. As another thing was going and walking through our neighborhood, even walking, I had a young man when I was a little kid, probably in elementary school. I experienced it as early as elementary school. In elementary school, he would call me the N-word on the way home from school. I was, traumatized by it. I go and tell my parents what was happening. It ended up being a very serious situation where we all got in trouble because I was trying to retaliate, even at an early age. Even in our families, even as in African Americans, there's a lot of times that racism happens right in the family. You know, one person is lighter than the other, or darker than the other. And I've heard this over and over again. Oh, he's the dark one. You know, oh, he's, because you're lighter skinned, you're better. That's racism. We've even done it to ourselves, at times. So even in our immediate families, there's been friends and colleagues. I've been on jobs where I was discriminated because of my color. Even when I was smarter and did things better, I didn't get the same pay raise or the same money or the same promotions that other people got because of color, because of the color of my skin. Organizations, sometimes even the services that some people receive, they get better services if you're Caucasian than you do when you're white. Than when you do when you're African American, or even not even just African American, a person of color, brown, Hispanic, or whatever. That's been done. And society looks at us different. We're the lower totem pole, or the lower part of the society. We're the lower group. So as we're looking at this, we can go back and look, and I can go back and look at my life as a person of color, that I've recognized racism in all of this. But the key that I'm going to talk about later in my later session is that it can be healed. It can be forgiven. It can be let go. And we're going to talk about that as I go into my second session when I talk about healing racial trauma. So this was just a little tip, and I'm going to turn it back over to Andy to talk about resilience, and then I'll come into healing trauma, racial trauma.
Okay, great. And we're right on schedule here. So I think it's always important to remember that there's a flip side to trauma, and that is that people are incredibly resilient. And you don't have to, when you start recognizing all the sources of trauma out there and all the ways people are being traumatized, and there's a tendency to start getting like a little, oh my God, I've got to approach everybody as if they're so fragile and maybe they're traumatized. You don't have to do that, because people are really strong and resilient, and we have to always keep that in mind. So next slide. So there are a couple of key concepts in the arena of resilience that are important to understand. First, protective factors. There are things in your life that protect you against the negative impact of trauma. There are things like religious and spiritual beliefs. If you have a strong religious set of beliefs, you'd be surprised how protective that is, even if you experience trauma. Having caring relationships, a loving, trusting, caring relationship, just one person in your life can make a huge difference. And I can't tell you how many people I have talked to who had extraordinary trauma backgrounds, and then they'll say, but then there was my aunt. And thank God for my aunt, because she pulled me through. One loving, caring relationship. Just think about what a difference that can make. Having meaning in your life. It doesn't have to be religious belief. Having something that you think bigger than yourself, that's giving your life meaning. Those factors are incredibly protective. So if we can start building those factors into everybody's life, make sure every child has at least one loving, caring relationship, we can go a long way to reducing the impact of trauma. Equally important are coping strategies. We all have coping strategies, okay? Every single person is a survivor, and all of us have figured out how to cope with bad stuff that happens to us. And it's really important to remember that we do have these coping strategies, and even if they're not completely healthy or adaptive, they're working for us. So one of the best things you can do if you're with somebody who's talking about their trauma history and you're trying to be helpful is ask them, you know, what's worked for you in the past? Because everybody has something that's worked for them. And, you know, I'm spending a little time on this because I don't think we recognize the extent to which we depend on coping strategies all the time. And as I said, even if they're not the perfect, most healthy coping strategies, if they're working for us, you can't ask us to give them up. So an example is substance use. Okay, not the healthiest way to cope, but for people who have serious trauma histories, using substances can be a coping strategy. It helps them dull the pain, it helps them get through life. So you can't ask them to stop using substances if it's working for them to calm their pain without giving them an alternative or helping them heal from the trauma. So we have to get a little more sophisticated in our efforts to help people move to more healthy coping strategies. And finally, resilience itself. It's basically the ability to overcome difficulties, to bounce back after something bad happens. And it's important to remember that resilience includes both internal skills, which we can teach, and we can easily teach kids, and also those protective factors. Resilience is not a unitary thing. It's not like either you are resilient or you're not. I hear people talking like, oh, he's so resilient, as if this other person isn't.
Yeah.
People are resilient in one area or one situation and not so resilient in another. And our job in a trauma-informed system is to look for people's coping strategies, look for ways in which they're resilient, and then support those. Okay, next slide. Real quickly, because I want to turn this back to Helen again. There's actually a concept called post-traumatic growth. In the trauma movement, we use a quote from Ernest Hemingway a lot. I forget which one of his novels it's from. It might be For Whom the Bell Tolls. People get stronger at the broken places. And actually, it's true. Most people, as they heal from trauma, discover that they're coming out the other side stronger and wiser and more compassionate than they were before the trauma happened. And we could do a whole session just on post-traumatic growth, but that's really where we're trying to help people to get to change their narrative from being a victim to being a survivor, to use their experience to grow their own compassion for others, to understand the importance of mutual support, to develop a sense of personal and collective power and mastery. And often post-traumatic growth entails a deeper spiritual wisdom and a recognition of cultural healing strategies. So it's a really important, next slide, thing to keep in mind, particularly when we're talking about racism. This quote kind of sums up resilience in my mind. Rechanneled rage can be a powerful energy source, helping youth of color to discover and cultivate what is great in and about them. So even negative emotions can contribute to building positive aspects of your life. So Helen?
All right. Okay, now healing racial trauma. This is my expertise that I've learned. The first thing that I learned, that this is a thought cycle, that we all think the same. If I have a negative thought, I'm going to have a negative feeling, a negative behavior, and a negative result. What I learned, that when people are even using racial slurs, or they're talking about they hate or they dislike, it's something they've learned. It's a thought that has been embedded in their mind. So if I am thinking that I'm a racist and I hate this person of color, the feelings are going to be there, the behavior is going to come out, and the result is going to be, you're going to demonstrate that. When we have a thought, we automatically get a feeling followed by a behavior, then a result. It can be a positive or negative event. What I always tell people, that when a baby is born into this world, that baby comes in here so innocent. It does not say, excuse me, it's a black baby. Excuse me, nurse, I'm a black baby. Can I get a black nurse to take care of me? No, it's a learned thing. Racism is learned. If we come home to something called a family and we start learning our ideas and we start picking up stuff, and that's where it comes into our thought pattern, that those are our beliefs and we really believe them. So we automatically have those feelings about whatever we're thinking about. If my family has taught me that I'm supposed to be racist, this is the way it goes, that baby believes it. The good news about this thought wheel is that I can have a negative thought. I can have a feeling. Automatically, thoughts and feelings go together. You having a positive thought, you're going to have a positive feeling. You having a negative thought, you're going to have a negative feeling. The key that I learned 24 years ago that changed my life, I can have a thought and I can have a feeling, but I don't have to act on it. That's when the healing comes. I don't have to get to the behavior and I don't have to get to the result. All I have to do is remember that it's just a thought. Even if someone's taught it to me or told it to me, it's not real. It's just a thought. And the one thing I can say about racism too, it comes from fear. And my definition of fear is false evidence appearing real. When we've learned something, it's been embedded in us, we believe it. We believe that that's true. Okay, Annalise, you can go to the next slide. This is the gift that we all have. It says, deep down inside, all people are the same. We all share a precious gift, no matter who we are, where we come from, or whatever we've been through in life. Every one of us is born with a core of wisdom, common sense, compassion, and power. This is our birthright. We all experience challenges in life, difficulties that may seem impossible to overcome. The good news that is within each of us is a source of comfort and true guidance. It is a spiritual connection that can never be broken. Sometimes we can feel far away from this connection, caught up in the worries and problems of everyday life. The key to finding it again is very simple. All we have to do is remember that it's there. It is only our own thinking that keeps us from seeing this. As human beings, we all have countless thoughts passing through our minds all the time. When we latch on to thoughts that bring pain, we feel pain and see the world through that lens. From this state of mind, we feel lost and far away from the peace that is our true nature. What a relief it is to realize that thoughts are not permanent. They only last as long as we give them life. Only one true self, our inner wisdom, our spiritual connection, is the permanent and the real. Knowing this eases the grip of negative thoughts when we allow a painful thought to pass without judging ourselves for having it. The beautiful feeling of who we really are brings us back into harmony with life. When I had learned this about 24 years ago, and I was in a relationship that was not good, I was not feeling, not in a loving mood for this person. I wouldn't say I was racist towards him, but I didn't have a good feeling. But when they told me that he had this inside of him, I thought, no, this is a very evil person. You know, he was abusive. This is not there. This made me see racism even different. I started seeing, and I'll talk a few minutes about the innocence in people. Because like I said, we don't come into this world being racist or hating or seeing a difference in anybody. We learn and we're taught this. We by society, by family, by those people, the things that I talked about earlier, in school, with our friends, with our colleagues, with our family, we're learning this. So you can go to the next slide, Annalise. So that is where it comes to this, seeing innocence. When someone acts unkindly, if we take it personally, we can be thrown into a downward spiral of anger, blame, and judgment. These negative thoughts can create greater conflict, misunderstanding, and unfortunate results. The more aware we are, the less we are affected by others' actions. We may feel angry for a moment, but the anger fades as we realize we are losing touch with what became so precious, our peace of mind. As wisdom returns, we can smile inwardly, seeing the innocence of the one who has harmed us, realizing that we truly have not been harmed at all. Instead of anger, we feel compassion for another soul who is perhaps blinded by thoughts of fear, just like I said, fear and confusion. We are no longer at the mercy of outside circumstances. I remember for 16 years of my working life, I worked as a home health, last 6 years, I worked as a nurse's aide. But the last 6 years, I worked as a home health aide. And I had a gentleman, I worked out in Plant City, like out in the rural parts of the city where we, African Americans shouldn't go to their house or whatever. And I had one gentleman, an older man, and he was like in his 80s, older man that needed my help. He had cancer. And I would go to him and I'd always save him for last because I already know he's not going to let me in his house. That was just not, I was not coming. The end was not coming in his home. So the first time I went there, I was kind of offended. And I was like, oh, but then I thought about this, the power of forgiveness. That's the next thing we're going to talk about in a minute. But I realized that I saw him as a little boy, a baby that grew up. He's 80-something years old. So you knew he grew up in a time where racism was okay. There were separate water fountains. There was separate this. I started seeing him so different that I saw the innocence in what he was doing. So my key thing was I'd save him for last because it took me like an hour, maybe an hour and a half to work with one patient. So I said, well, you know what? I won't come in, but you sign my paper. So he signed my paper so I get paid for taking care of him. And I also got mileage, okay, for going to Plant City because I'm from Tampa. So I was like, you know what? He's really blessing me. He think he's being ugly, but he's really being nice to me, So I had started learning how not to take it personally, but to see the flip side of it and see the good part. Now, the power of forgiveness, this is it. One of the most beautiful gifts we can give ourselves. Did I say anybody else? No. Forgiveness is not for the other person, it's for ourselves. It's to learn the art of forgiveness, to see that when we hold resentment against anyone, we really hurt ourselves. Forgiveness brings freedom and lets us live more fully, life more fully. As long as we let thoughts about someone else, what someone else did or said, turn around in our mind, we feel upset. The same thing happens when we hold unforgiving thoughts against ourselves. In this state of mind, we don't see clearly, feel happy, or do our best. On the other hand, when we let go of a grudge, a lightness of spirits takes its place. In this more peaceful state of mind, we find understanding and joy. Sometimes people see forgiveness as a sign of weakness. We may think that by forgiving someone who hurts us, we're letting that person have some kind of control over us. Actually, the opposite is true. When we are unforgiving, we are the ones who suffer. Unforgiving thoughts hold us prisoners, keeping us in a state of stress and preventing us from feeling comfortable. Forgiveness is powerful. It frees us from the chains of a painful past. To forgive does not mean to approve. We can forgive someone without approving of the behavior. It all comes down to the feeling we have inside. If someone is dangerous, it's common sense to stay away from that person. But it's possible to do this without carrying hate in our hearts. What forgiveness means is seeing that deep down, we are all the same. We all make mistakes. We all have a lot to learn. Anyone can change. When you start seeing it this way, it makes it so much difference. Is there another slide, Annalise? That's questions and answers. All right. So thank you so much.
So we did save some time to hopefully have some questions and answers and discussion.
I have a question for Helen, because I know that you do, I think you did a teaching just this month, did you not, earlier? You do ongoing sessions.
Right.
You're working with folks. Can you talk a little bit about that? And,
yes.
And when you might do another one?
Okay, we have another one coming up next week, Annalise, I think. Don't we have one Wednesday and Thursday of next week, I think? And they're called Letting Go of a Traumatic Past. And these are really where we kind of get one-on-one in our face. I mean, there's questions. It's a lot of time to open up. And I teach people what I learned, those principles, 3 principles that I learned called mind, thought, and consciousness, and how learning that has helped me let go of my traumatic past. So I share my story, and I even let people know how you can be healed from things from the past. Because a lot of times we don't realize that we're holding on to things that happened to us in the past. A good example is one thing that I talk about when I go about letting go of traumatic past. I grew up with domestic violence, and then I ended up getting in relationships, as Andy was saying, with domestic violence. So I ended up homeless with my children. I ended up losing everything. And when I learned this, understand that I teach in these classes, letting go of a traumatic past, I was healed the first day of class, because I was so upset by how this husband had treated me. We separated in 1991. I took this class in 1996. And the lady that was taking the class, she said, well, think of someone you dislike. I immediately thought about this person. I had my man, I had him. And then she said, well, when is the last time he did it to you? And I said, 1991. And she said, you do know this is 1996. Who's doing it to you now? So sometimes we're holding on. That's why I say letting go. Because I was doing it by way of my thinking. I was remembering, just like I did with that thought wheel, I was having that thought and I was having those feelings, panic attacks, Xanax, mental hospital. But I'm not going to give you too much because I want you to come to the class. So, and they're free. They're free classes. They're 4-hour workshops. We do 2 on Wednesday night. I think it's Wednesday morning this week. I'm coming up next week. Annalise will send out the reminder again. And then it's 2 the next day. And I've seen people come on there and they've really changed. They've let go of stuff. We've seen churches and housing authority clients that have really changed their life just by understanding how we think. Mm-hmm.
And in doing that, in helping people to heal and let go of their own traumatic past, you're also helping them break the intergenerational cycle. So you're creating a better future. Not only a better present, but a better future. You're actually helping to heal the planet. And her workshops are fantastic. So just putting in a plug.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I did put the link in the chat box where you can check our event and workshop schedule. We try to update that as much as possible. But I will also send it out to everyone who was here this evening, Helen's classes.
And I saw somebody in the chat asked if you could have the slides and if the recording was going to be posted. And the answer is yes to both. We can send out a copy of the slide deck to everybody who registered. And Shirley is recording this, so we'll have it archived on the Sarasota Strong website.
Right. And I do the thing with the letting go. I give the slides because we won't see people that you see. And if we can our goal was to get Sarasota totally trauma informed and healed. So we give out our stuff. So please feel free to come.
And feel free to spread it around.
Yes.
Other people have questions, comments, stories you'd like to share from your own experience. Anything that resonates with you.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Murphy, and it's very interesting what you talked about parents. My mother, and I'm 82, so I'm one of the older ones. But anyway, when I was growing up, my mother worked, and every day she would come home and say, "Oh, my friend and I, we laughed all the way downtown." We lived in Detroit at the time. That's how she was described, never with a name, never anything else. So one day I got on the Joy Road bus with my mother, and she goes, "Oh, there's my friend." And the woman was African-American. And that was probably one of the biggest gifts my mother had ever given me.
Wow.
And passed through to our children and our children and the people that they have married. And that's where we're at. And I'm with SURE and also with First Presbyterian in Sarasota. What are you doing? Do you ever have police officers attend any of your sessions? Have you met with Sheriff Knight or Chief DePino regarding that?
We have had a number of police officers attend our community forums. There are several who, when we were meeting in person, were coming to every forum in the North County forums. And we had one police officer who wants to get the basic training in trauma-informed community organizing that Helen and I and others have taken. So we have some individual officers who are interested. I also, right before COVID hit, was invited by, I'm forgetting his name, but he's a captain. He reports to Chief DePino, and he was very interested in partnering with us around some community work because they saw the power of this. That didn't actually happen because COVID happened and we've all been busy. But the police are clearly, when you talk about vicarious trauma, they're carrying a huge trauma load of their own. And until they learn to handle that better and learn to see trauma in themselves and do self-care and heal from some of their own trauma, they're not going to be able to be the kind of police that we need and want. So it's really essential to get this information and to get this work happening with all of our first responders, but particularly our law enforcement. So hopefully we'll be doing that in the coming years.
I want to address a comment in the chat function real quick. Someone said they were interested about the Raising Anti-Racist Children workshop, but it's at a bad time. This is something that we actually just launched the program, so we will plan for more in the future. We don't have future dates set just yet.
But you can go to the website and sign up. If the times are not good that are listed, don't worry, because we're already planning a second workshop during the month of October because there's been so much demand, and it will be at on different days and times than the one that's listed. So go ahead and sign up, and hopefully, the second workshop, the times and dates will work better for you.
Yeah, we have a waiting list of people, so if you go ahead and just register, then we'll have you on our list to offer for you when we have that second one could roll out.
Okay, who else, what resonated with you? Stories you want to tell, share, questions that you have. We went very fast. We covered a lot of material in a short period of time, so I'm sure you have some questions.
Andrea?
Yes.
And Helen, thank you for your presentation. I want to talk a little bit and think a little bit about forgiveness. I'm a rabbi and come from our Jewish tradition, which I think to some degree has a slight difference than it seems to me what is more of a Christian, at least portrayed as a Christian view of sort of unilateral forgiveness. It's upon the person who's been traumatized to forgive without necessarily getting any kind of apology or repentance from the person who's the abuser or the traumatizer. And it seems to me that you're kind of painting it as, Helen, as sort of either if you don't forgive, then you'll just hate. I think you can get rid of the hate without completely forgiving someone either. And it is, I think it is transactional. Forgiveness should also be accompanied or preceded by someone having responsibility say, I'm sorry. Now, sometimes you won't get that from
You won't get it.
I realize that, and you have to then make a choice. But I think there is a difference. You can not forgive, but not necessarily hate either. In other words, forgive and opens yourself up to a certain level of being abused again, possibly, and being hurt again. So I don't think it's quite that forgiveness has to be, in a sense, that unilateral. I think that also puts a certain amount of pressure on the abused person, the traumatized person, to say, gee, if I don't forgive, I'm not of loving heart and so forth. So I'm wondering if there's a little more gray area in there in terms of not expecting yourself to forgive, but not necessarily being filled with rage and hate as well.
Do you want to take that, Helen, or do you want me to?
Okay, I'll do it. Because when I talked about forgiveness, as I said about that husband that I didn't forgive, and I was having panic attacks. I was getting literally ill because every time I think about what he was doing to me, I had this anger and this hurt in me that I was not healing. He wasn't even doing it to me. He had stopped, went on with his life, but I was still taking Xanax, seeing a psychiatrist, spending time in a mental hospital based on me not just letting it go. And we'll always remember what happened to us. But when I was living it daily, I was holding on to it and had that unforgiveness. Once I just realized and saw the innocence in him, that's why I said that, seeing that innocence in that person. If someone dangerous, you stay away from them. I'm not saying, like, I've not been in another relationship like that because I know now what to look for and I can kind of back out. It kind of taught me. But the forgiveness part, I realized I was not forgiving him. I was not letting it go. And, I wasn't letting it go. I was holding on to it. So it wasn't hurting him. It was hurting me. So when I talk about that as the healing, I got healed when I saw him differently. And then I realized he was doing what his dad did. It was a cycle of the abuse and stuff. So I kind of started seeing him different. We're good friends now today. We have a son and 6 grandkids that we just get along great. But I would never marry him again. I would not get in that relationship. I don't have that. But I don't have that hate.
I'd like to add a little something to that because in the trauma movement, we talk about this a lot. And one thing is absolutely clear, and that is people will forgive when they're ready to forgive. Yeah. And you can't tell somebody to forgive or say you ought to, or you'll feel better if you do. If they're not ready, they won't. They're not. It's not going to happen. And that's okay. That's absolutely okay. And the other side of it, and you might have been alluding to this, Rabbi Schull, justice is a really important factor as well in healing. And there are times where a trauma survivor really needs to see that justice has been done in order to heal. And that's real too. And we often encourage people who are working with trauma survivors to talk about that and to encourage the survivor to take steps to try to, if it was a systemic issue, to try to work at in some kind of activist way, whatever it takes to have them feel like they're working towards justice about what happened. And that's also a really powerful dynamic and can be incredibly important in healing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll also add on to it. Sometimes, you know, you may be looking for that, that gratification of, you know, someone actually saying, I'm sorry. Someone had mentioned that, like actually getting that sorry. And I've actually found myself in positions where I've gotten that apology and it didn't give me that gratification I was looking for, because like Helen mentioned, there was something inside me that needed to heal. I wasn't forgiving myself for the situation and other things that was going on. So even if you do get that from, you know, the abuser or someone on the other end, it's not always going to fulfill you or give you that gratifying feeling.
Right, but I guess one final thing I'll add, I don't know if you necessarily have to see the person as innocent. I think you can see them as a human being who's flawed.
Exactly.
I guess I have a little trouble with that idea that they're innocent. I think sometimes people choose to do bad and they're not, and they're responsible for that bad. And we don't have to necessarily, you know, fool ourselves or trick ourselves into thinking what was their hurt. I mean, I think it's helpful to look at that, and that's important. But at some point, sometimes people freely, because of their just make up their selfishness, do horrible, hurtful things, and we can still see them as flawed, very flawed human beings, and that may be helpful. But again, I had trouble with seeing them as innocent necessarily.
Yeah, and innocent is just the word, just like you said, flawed human being. That could be the same thing. That's, you know what I'm saying? It's a wording, you know. So it's kind of like, it don't have to be innocent because they did it. They guilty of what they did, but they're a flawed human being. You could even use whatever term works. And that's the thing that I love about this understanding I learned. What works for you works for you, because we have separate realities and we won't all see things the same way.
Right.
You know? Yeah.
Other questions, or we have one more minute. Anybody have a burning question or story you want to share?
Well, I would just like to say that in Venice Interfaith, we've been on this for a couple of years, as you mentioned, Andy, and I'm always surprised at how many layers there are in, you know, peeling this onion. The interactions involved with racism and anti-racism on the part of both the people who perpetrate it and the people who are victims are so just astoundingly complex. We've been reading books and, you know, trying to understand these dynamics, and now understanding how these things can be intergenerational is kind of a new thought for me. I just having to work that through. So I know we're going to have another thank you following this, but I just want to be sure to say thank you, because I think you brought some wonderful new insight to our ongoing study of racism and anti-racism.
Thank you for the opportunity.
We just had Lisa Beavers raise her hand. Did you have a comment you wanted to add?
Just quickly, I really enjoyed this session, and I found it. I've just finished a session with Dr. Joy DeGruy in her book of post-traumatic slave disorder, and very similar things are being said, you know, especially about the trauma. And you know, just attending some, you know, I feel as a white person, we have to get over our innate superiority. You know, we have a role to play, and I think we have to role to play to know the history. And so for these last weeks, I've been diving into the history and doing my part. In fact, my devotion, I'm a Baha'i from the Villages area. And I've always worked with a lot of interfaith organizations, and I heard about your program tonight. It was really nice. And would love to dialogue some more, because I just feel like we have to really understand and how to get along and how to have new approaches. Someone recently told me, you know, that you have to, you know, really take maybe a step back and listen more, you know. But for friends that have had some very racist kind of comments lately, I heard this comment to ask what motivates you to say that, you know, to hear what the history is. I thought that was a great line to understanding somebody and maybe having them explain themselves. And Helen, you really went into that really well, like maybe their background and where they come from, you know, maybe has something to do with why they're saying this. And you have to befriend them and show kindness and, you know, through kindness and look at people's good points and not the bad. You know, if a person has 10 good qualities and just, you know, one bad one, always look at the good and not the bad. And you know, we have to look at what's good in people. I once heard that, you know, if a room is dark, you don't say bring all your darkness into the room.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe someone has maybe they're a very little good person. You know, they have good in them. Maybe it's not a lot. But our job is not to find the darkness, it's to find the good in people.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
seek that out. So, but very, very good program tonight. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And I would encourage you all to go to the SRQ Strong website and sign up. We have programs every month, a community conversation, and also have workshops and trainings and all kinds of other stuff going on. So if you're interested in this topic, join the team.
Great.
All right.
I think that about wraps it up. Andy,
I think Rabbi Scholl is going to close it out.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrea. Again, I also want to thank Helen and Andrea and Shirley and all the members of VICA to help put this program together. And just want to give a little encouragement for those of you who may not be involved in VICA, the Venice Interfaith Community Association, to check us out. And we do have a website, and there are opportunities to get involved. There are a number of committees that are always looking for people to get involved. We happen to think that our organization has a very special role to play in certainly in South County, but really throughout the county, particularly at this time. You know, you would talk about trauma. It may not be as directly impacting us, but the experience that we're going through, world events, the pandemic, etc. I'm sure we're all aware that this, to some degree, is traumatic for all of us, some more than others, loss of job, loss of loved ones. And more than ever, we need to have a group like VICA that brings people together, that can share these wonderful, valuable resources and share the strength of all of our varied traditions. We happen to feel it's more vital than ever. So again, if you'd like to get involved, please just go to the Venice Interfaith Community Association website. What's the website name, Shirley?
VeniceInterfaith.org. I'll put it in the chat.
There you go. I should have known that. So, but please let us know, and we'd love to have your help. We were looking to grow and get more people involved. So thank you, everyone.
All right. Have a great night, guys.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.